Welcome to meeting number 50 of the Standing Committee on Official Languages of the House of Commons. Pursuant to the order of reference of Monday, May 30th, 2022, the committee is resuming consideration of BC 13, an act to amend the Official Languages Act, enact the use of French and federally regulated private businesses act, and to make related amendments to other acts. And in keeping with our routine motion, I would inform the committee that all members have undertaken connection tests before the meeting. I want to welcome you once again, welcome all of the officials. We have from the Department of Canadian Heritage, Ms. Boyer, Marcel Valu, Chantal Terrien for the Department of Justice, Mr. Warren Newman from the Treasury Board Secretariat, Karsten Quell. So thank you for being here once again. We are resuming clause by clause consideration. And when we adjourned, we had Mr. Beaulieu and Mr. Serret who were debating. So CPC 15. If you could move to that amendment. Mr. Chairman, excuse me. We heard from Ms. Boyer, and what I understood regarding my amendment was that it wasn't necessary because there was protection in the preamble for that. So I would ask for unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment. Nobody opposed on screen? No? Very well, thank you. Mr. Gaudin? Therefore, I know that you will have remembered my comment earlier. So BQ 14 drops as a result of that withdrawal. So we actually now are page 45. We are going to amend our amendment, BQ 14. So we're just going to suspend for a moment so that everybody can find it.
OK, nous reprenons.
Okay, we will resume. Everybody has looked at the clause. So we have an addition at the end of 14, and this says that there will be no limit to services already offered to Francophones and Anglophones. Mr. Beaulieu, just very quickly, I want to make a comment. I just want to quickly review what we've done up to now. We have studied 13 out of 71 amendments. We are on page 44 of 299 pages. We might have other amendments as we go along. And we only have 4 more meetings. So I just wanted to point that out so that maybe we can find a way to perhaps add some meetings so that we can go through all the amendments. So do you want to introduce another amendment? Yes, very quickly. In fact, we want to add that English and French, where am I here? I just want to make sure I'm at the right place. So we want to add to Section 33 that the Governor and Council shall take into consideration the minority status of the French language in Canada due to the predominant use of English and the linguistic specificity of Quebec. And we want to add that this will not do anything to services that are already provided to Anglophones and Francophones. Thank you.
With regards to the sub-amendment by my colleague, I just wanted to ask officials in terms of this new statement being made. The first question would be really, do you not see a contradiction with regards to the spirit of the previous amendment, because B14 resembles, in terms of the first part, almost word for word, the CPC 15, which has been withdrawn. And so the language being used in the first part is almost identical. And we've heard the testimony last week. I paid particular attention to both your response, Madame Boyer, as well as Mr. Quells. So my first question to you is, do you not see a contradiction with regards to the sub-amendment? And my next question really would be, does this not pose does this not open the door to constitutional challenges? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So on the first, I think, because I don't have the text in front of me, but I took note when you read it, Mr. Beaulieu, it seems to still maintain an obligation with shall or en français, pra, into consideration. So that is an obligation to demonstrate that this was taken into consideration. And I don't think that that obligation disappears with an additional sentence that says it should not affect or services already offered to Anglophones. And there I would pause because I wonder if already offered to Anglophones suggests that it could impact new services or the offer of new services to Anglophones in Quebec. Okay.
Monsieur Godin sur la liste et ensuite Monsieur Housefather. Oh.
Mr. Godin, Mr. Housefather.
To be directed to Mr. Newman in terms of, do you not see this opening the door to constitutional challenges?
Well, the courts are always open for business, and there are constitutional challenges to many provisions of many statutes. Here, this is a provision that would take into account a factual situation that the French is in a minority situation in Canada, and would also take into account predominant use of English linguistic specificity of Quebec. It's all in the context of making regulations. I do not think it's necessary to add such a provision, there are already plenty of earlier provisions in the Act that guide the interpretation of the Act, that guide the spirit of the Act and the way these implementing provisions are to be carried out. We're in a part of the Act, as I said last time, we're in a part of the Act that really deals with implementing a constitutional guarantee, Section 20 of the Charter. And we don't want to stray too far from the principle of Section 20, which is really to provide services in both English and French at an operational level and to ensure communications in both languages with the public. So this is really à côté, this is really to the side of that, and I don't think it is relevant to the implementation of the Section 20 Charter guarantees in Part 4, which Part 4 was designed to deal with.
Merci, Monsieur Newman.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Mr. Godin. Thank you, Chair. I think that what my colleague wants to do is ensure that the two minority language groups, the two OLMCs, so Quebec Anglophones and Francophones outside Quebec, we want to ensure that these two groups are not threatened or harmed. And I think we need to make sure that we are not pitting Francophones and Anglophones against one another. I think it's important to work towards that. We want to make sure that in Canada, the two official languages are not confronted or pitted against one another. So I appreciate this new amendment from the Bloc. I believe it shows willingness on the part of the Bloc, I assume. I know there's willingness on the part of the Conservative Party to ensure that we are not working against Anglophones. We are working for both official languages. And since the very beginning of debate on this bill, three things have been important: stopping the decline of French, protecting and promoting both official languages. So, Chair, I think it's very important to pay attention to this and the philosophy behind it. The philosophy behind this should extend all throughout the rest of the debate, and the Conservatives will be willing to support that. Mr. Housefather, then Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you. Very quickly.
Madame Boyer. Well, I appreciate the addition from my colleague, Mr. Beaulieu, to try to fix the overall problem, which is this is directing you to do something which is contrary to the overall intention of the Act. The addition, cet article n'aurait pas pour effet de...
This clause will not have as an effect to reduce services already offered to the Anglophone and Francophone communities.
Well, if there was a new service being offered, stop you from having to do exactly what you had mentioned before would be the consequence of this amendment, which is to consider how to limit that service in English in Quebec, taking into consideration that French services are to be offered more predominantly. Would that be correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
And then secondly, for example, with signage, which is not a service, right, that you would then have to take into consideration as opposed to federal signage in Quebec being French-English equal as it is in the rest of the country, you would need to take into account this and perhaps make the signage predominantly or almost entirely in French, correct?
This is one of the measures that my colleague Carsten Quell mentioned could be taken to meet this obligation, yes.
And I could come up with 50 or 60 of these other kinds of things to explain why this doesn't work, but thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Mr. Beaulieu? Just for your information, the whole point of this is to recognize that French is threatened and that we live in a reality where English is predominant in Canada and in North America. So it was never the objective of, say, Bill 101 to limit services to Anglophones. What we want is that newcomers to recognize that French is the official and common language of Quebec. And this is the only way to make sure that we will be able to successfully integrate newcomers into their Francophone host society and give them the resources to feel included. So if there are new services, I mean, the laws will still be there. I imagine this would still apply to new services just as it applies to existing ones. And I think it's important to always recognize the minority status of French within Canada and within the continent, because French is in decline. In the Act, the federal government, for the first time in 50 years, is recognizing that it needs to protect French, not just outside Quebec, but also within Quebec. I think right now, we need to enact this philosophy. And one way of going about this is always interpreting things while taking into account the context. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Before going to Mr. Garneau and Ms. Latanzio, just to let you know, it came up, someone mentioned a sub-amendment. We are not talking about a sub-amendment. We have gotten rid of the old version of BQ 14. This is a new version. So people are talking like it's an amendment. It is not. It's the main motion. Mr. Chair, I don't think it's necessary to make those sorts of comments. As you know, Chair, amendments are not public until they are moved. So it would be important. It would be important not to spell out the whole process ahead of time. No. I'm not talking about the content of the former B14. It's just that people were talking about a possible sub-amendment. We are not talking about a sub-amendment. That's what I wanted to correct, this understanding. I don't want to talk about an amendment. There is just one BQ 14 that Mr. Beaulieu has just moved. I just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Mr. Garneau, over to you. A quick observation, Chair. BQ 14 and CPC 15 are essentially the same thing, except for the second part of BQ 14. Point of order, Chair. That's what Mr. Godin was just saying. CPC 15 is gone. It was withdrawn through unanimous consent. All right. Okay, I withdraw my comment in that case. Ms. Latanzio, I will be quick. Per the comments we heard today, I understand that the consensus is to protect and promote French. I also understand, colleagues, that this section would not strengthen French in Quebec. On one side, I see that it's contradictory. And if my colleague truly wants to strengthen French in Quebec, well then, this amendment doesn't do it. And because of that, I will vote against. No one on the screen. Mr. Godin, over to you. Just to add on to what my colleague was saying, it's probably a response to everything we're hearing about in the news, this idea that Francophones and Anglophones are being pitted against one another. But again, I respect your comment, Ms. Latanzio. I see no one around the table, no one on the screen, so we can move ahead to a vote.
Contre.
Monsieur Drouin,
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono,
Contre.
Madame Bradford,
Contre.
Madame Latanzio,
Contre.
Monsieur Godin,
Pour.
Monsieur Gourde,
Pour.
Monsieur Généreux,
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux,
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu et Madame Ashton.
Contre.
Donc, 5.
As such, 5 yeas, 6 nays, B14 is rejected. Do we adopt Section 13? Yes. All right, this brings us to Section 14, CPC 16, page 46 in the document bundle. Mr. Godin, over to you. Thank you, Chair. Here, I think it's important that people with major roles within the federal public service to understand both official languages. In the past, we have observed problems with accessibility, with accessing promotions for people who were unilingual. I believe my amendment, CPC 16, would support employees as they work in the official language of their choice. So I'm going to read the amendment that Bill C-13 in Clause 14 be amended by adding after line 32 on page 8 the following. 2. Persons appointed by the Governor and Council to the following positions in federal institutions must, on their appointment, be able to speak and understand clearly both official languages. A. Deputy Minister, Associate Deputy Minister, and positions of equivalent ranks. And here I would add, Chair, that in 2013, an act was passed under Stephen Harper's Conservative government. And in that law, it had the exact same wording as I've used now. And it was a law about language abilities within the public service. So here I want to note that Conservatives have always defended the French language. Any questions? I see no hands raised, neither here nor online. So we could proceed to a vote.
Monsieur Seri?
Contre.
Monsieur Drouin?
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono?
Contre.
Madame Bradford? Madame Latanzio?
Contre.
Monsieur Godin?
Évidemment, Madame la greffière, que je suis.
Obviously, I am for this amendment. It is an important one.
Monsieur Généreux?
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux?
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu? Madame Ashton?
Pour.
Donc 6 pour,
6 yeas, 5 nays. The amendment is adopted. This brings us to BQ 15. Oh, thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Following BQ 15, this brings us to BQ 16. Now I'm at page 48, so if you're following along in the document bundle, BQ 16. Mr. Beaulieu, the floor is yours. Just following up on what my Conservative colleague was saying. Mr. Godin. Here we would say that Bill C-13 in Clause 14 be amended by adding after line 32 on page 8 the following. The deputy head or other administrative head of any federal institution and the chief executive officer of any corporation subject to the Act must, at the time of their appointment, be able to speak and understand French clearly. This would allow us to prevent things like we've seen, like CN having no Francophone administrators. Ms. Latanzio.
You, Madame Boyer, with regards to the amendment, when we speak of the chief executive officer of corporations, is it not shareholders who vote and appoint and not the government?
I would think that, yes, it would be a board that would decide, but this would become an obligation that would limit their choices in terms of appointing a bilingual candidate. They would be regulated to do that, legislated to do that, to be clear.
Can I follow up, Mr.? So therefore, what you're saying is that from this point on, with the adoption of this amendment, shareholders would no longer be able to appoint their own CEOs. It would be to the discretion of the government. Is that what we're getting in terms of the language of this sub-amendment? Or
My
amendment,
team
sorry?
is anxiously saying, no, no, no. We wouldn't appoint the candidate, but if this amendment is retained and C-13 passes, those private entities that have official language obligations from this legislation, so including, for example, Air Canada, would have to name a bilingual CEO. At the time of hire, this person would have to be fluently bilingual, is what this amendment says.
Okay.
Madame Ashton.
Ms. Ashton. Thank you, Chair. I would like to express my 100% support for this amendment. We believe that people at the heads of major corporations should be subject to the Official Languages Act. I just want to share some thoughts on the matter. First, it's ridiculous that there are people like the CEO of Air Canada and higher-ups at CN who don't understand French and who are unable to speak it. I think that this is a basic condition of their duty towards Canadians and Quebecers. It must be said, there is only one reason why some corporations are subject to this act, due to the privatization of years of neoliberal rule. This privatization has led to a loss of quality for Canadians and Quebecers, but also a loss of access to language rights. It's worthwhile asking what is going on in the National Capital Region. If you're Francophone, you are constantly taking part in meetings that go on only in English, and if you want to express a point, you have to do it in English. The heads of these corporations are only heads of private corporations because the government privatized away these companies. One of the few obligations remaining to them is the fact that they need to adhere to the Official Languages Act, and over, they have showed they have no interest in respecting the social contract. These companies have chosen heads who are able to speak just one of our two official languages. Even in the case of businesses present in Quebec, these people are unable to speak the official language of Quebec. Privatizing these businesses was a mistake in the first place. So the least we could do is make it so that the heads of these corporations are able to speak French. Thank you. Mr. Beaulieu, followed by Mr. Housefather. This is actually an amendment requested by the Quebec government. I believe it to be an important one. We want to ensure that heads of these organizations are able to speak French in Quebec and outside Quebec as well. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Housefather, followed by Mr. Godin. Thank you, Chair. First, I would just like to say that it should say to be able to speak and understand both official languages clearly, as was the phrasing in the previous amendment, because now you're creating asymmetry again. This could promote someone who is Francophone and who is unable to speak English. But I think that can easily be fixed through an amendment.
Two questions. Number one, it says any corporation subject to the Act. Now, we are introducing, in the old version of this bill, we had every corporation, every privately, every corporation under federal jurisdiction that was privately held that was subject to this Act. Is there any claim in the new version where there are two parallel acts that we're now trying to make every CEO of every privately regulated federal business need to speak both languages, including small businesses that have family-run CEOs? I mean, that I think in itself would be an absurdity. And the second question would be, let's say I am the CEO right now of a business that is subject to this act, and I do not speak one of the two official languages, or in this case, I don't speak French if it's not modified. Is the corporation then not already in breach by virtue of the fact that they have a CEO currently in place that doesn't speak the other official language? Would that person need to be terminated as a result because they're not in compliance with the act? Who is going to cover the severance of terminating that person? All of these things arise by having the word CEO I believe, in there and making it so. So I'm interested in hearing those answers.
Okay, I will do my best to answer this two-part question. So on the first part, I think the amendment only aims businesses, not private businesses, but
Corporations.
corporations, take it.
Corporation is most of the privately regulated federal businesses.
But if I may, the way the amendment text is formulated, it says the chief executive officer of any corporation subject to the act. So the act being the Official Languages Act.
Right, but remember in the C-21, the old version, in that act, we regulated all federally regulated private businesses. I just want to understand clearly that there's no leftover provisions in this act that somehow regulate everybody.
Yeah. In Bill C-13, okay, what Bill C-13 sets out to do, it modifies the Official Languages Act and it creates a new, different act for federally regulated private businesses.
And therefore, those companies would not be subject. We're really talking about the Air Canadas and other federal institutions that have Official Language Act obligations.
Est-ce que M. Quayle voudrait ajouter quelque chose?
Mr. Quell, would you like to add something?
I can add, I mean, some of the entities that will be touched by this amendment would be port authorities. So this could be a port authority in Western Canada. It would also be the airport authorities, which have an obligation to serve the public in both official languages. But so far, those airport authorities and those port authorities do not have to have CEOs that are bilingual upon appointment, just by way of clarification.
Thanks, Mr. Quayle. Monsieur Godin?
Mr. Godin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the comments that have been provided are very relevant because we are all aware that there are examples over the past few years that have made it clear that French was not respected in some businesses, some corporations, and certainly Air Canada is one of those. This amendment, in my opinion, is too general. I think it is important, and I think elsewhere in the Act we have this. We need to develop a bilingual culture in our businesses, in our public service, and elsewhere. So I think this amendment is too general, and that will mean that it limits the ability of bilingual people to have access to these positions and the obligation of people to acquire their second language, which isn't always easy. But I think this is the philosophy that we should be putting forward. So we don't have the bilingual philosophy in place, and we should bring it there. But I think this is an amendment that is too general. And I think that we are just muddying the waters. It is not clear enough here. I just want to be clear, says Mr. Garneau, about the remark by Mr. Quell. Are you saying that the Port Alberni Port Authority would have to be bilingual and Halifax, as well as airport authorities? For example, in Calgary or Vancouver. So those CEOs would have to be bilingual? Yes, that is the case. Any other comments on the screen around the table? No? I would ask the clerk to please take the vote.
Monsieur Serry?
Contre.
Monsieur Drouin?
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono?
Contre.
Madame Kayabaga? Madame Latanzio?
Contre.
Monsieur Godin?
Tout en étant pour le principe, je voterai contre cet amendement.
Monsieur Gourde? Monsieur Généreux?
Contre.
Monsieur Lehoux? Monsieur Beaulieu? Madame Ashton?
Pour.
So the vote is 9 against 4, 4, and the amendment is therefore defeated. That brings us to is clause 14 adopted? Carried. Very well. We move now to BQ 17. This amendment is also from the Government of Quebec, which replaces in line 40 on page 8 with the following. Language by its employees, allowing employees, in fact, to use either official language and to take into account the minority situation of French in Canada due to the predominant use of English and the linguistic specificity of Quebec. This is important. If we don't have an asymmetric system, then we won't be able to protect French in Quebec. The objective of this amendment is that because Quebec is in a minority situation, French is the minority language, then it has to be allowable for people to work in French. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Seki. I would ask Ms. Boyer to explain, or perhaps one of our colleagues from the Treasury Board or Justice, to how this would actually work.
Monsieur le Président, ce que...
Well, Mr. Chairman, what we could add as information regarding this amendment is that usually we treat bilingual teams the same way, whether we are talking about outside Quebec or in Quebec. If you have 10 people in Sherbrooke, you might have 8 francophones and 2 anglophones, and elsewhere in Canada, you would have the reverse. The rights of people in minority situations should be the same, and this amendment would change that approach. It would provide for different treatment. If I bring my example back, in Sherbrooke, for example, the Anglophones would be treated differently. Mr. Godin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Quell. We've seen him regularly, but we haven't had, or Mr. Fallu, rather. I think you worked on drafting this legislation, did you not? What is the meaning of the passage? Was it really targeting Quebec? Could you just repeat your question? So in subsection A, after line 25 in French, so this is on page 8 of Bill C-13. It says in the National Capital Region or in other designated areas, then there should be effective use of both official languages, or in other areas, one or other official language. Were you intending to include Quebec in this? Well, I would say that this clause of Bill C-13 was intended to correct a technical error, as were a number of other clauses in the bill, so I will limit myself to that. So it's really a technical amendment. Okay, well, here we have an amendment that talks about employees being able to use one or other language, taking into account the minority situation of French in Canada due to the predominant use of English and the linguistic specificity of Quebec. So we want to add that, but according to your interpretation, when you drafted the bill, were you thinking of Quebec as being integrated into the coverage of this? This is part of the bill that comes under Treasury Board responsibility, in fact, so perhaps Mr. Quell should respond. You are with Canadian Heritage, is that right? Yes. So I didn't understand. We work together between the departments. I didn't write this myself. I took part in the drafting. So Treasury Board is responsible for Part 5 of the bill, and we did take part in the drafting of this part of the bill. So I can confirm that there was an intention here to include Quebec because this is there are regions that are designated as being bilingual in Ontario, Quebec, and the province of New Brunswick. Mr. Gaudin, well, that's a bit of a sensitive subject because Quebec, in my opinion, is not a region, it is a province, so we should be careful about the wording. I understand why you would talk about the National Capital Region because it covers Ottawa and the parts of Quebec, but if that was the intention, that is identifying Quebec as a region, then I would say that Quebec has a particular status. Quebec, in my opinion, is a unilingual francophone province. If I may, I would just like to correct something. I did not mean that Quebec is a bilingual region, but there are bilingual areas such as the island of Montreal, Northern Ontario. These are bilingual regions, but outside those regions, for example, Quebec City is considered unilingual French. So the language of Quebec outside the bilingually designated areas is always French. So there is, in Quebec City, for example, one cannot write briefing notes in English because the language of work in federal institutions is French, just as it is English in Toronto, Vancouver, and elsewhere. Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Quell answer this question? Does one have the right in Montreal or the Eastern Townships to write briefing notes only in English? In bilingual regions, if one has a bilingual position, you can choose your preferred language. So you would have the right, for example, to write your briefing notes either in English or in French. What is the description of a bilingual position, in your opinion? Bilingual positions come under Section 71 of the bill of the Act. A manager must look at the responsibilities of a position and determine whether it is bilingual. Is the manager bilingual? If the manager supervises an employee that has the right to be supervised in both official languages, then the manager must be bilingual, just as would be the case if there were employees of both official languages. Anything else? No. Anyone on screen? We will, if not, we will go to the vote.
Perry?
Contre.
Monsieur Drouin?
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono?
Contre.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Madame Latanzio?
Contre.
Monsieur Godin?
Je vais piler sur mon orgueil et je vais voter contre.
Monsieur Gourde?
Contre.
Monsieur Généreux?
Contre. Contre.
Monsieur Lehoux?
Contre.
Monsieur Beaulieu?
Pour.
Madame Ashton?
Contre.
Donc 10 contre, 1 pour.
10 against, 1 for. The amendment is defeated, and so this brings us to BQ 18 on page 51. So I'll just try to go a little more quickly. BQ 18, BQ 19, and BQ 20, so all three are withdrawn. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu, for that clarification. And we are now at CPC 18 on page 54. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm going too quickly. Is Clause 15 adopted? Yes? No abstentions? No. So carried. And that brings us to CPC 18, page 54. Mr. Godin? You have the floor, but I do want to say just before that, if CPC 18 is adopted, BQ 21, there would be a conflict with the lines. But go ahead, please, Mr. Godin, regarding CPC 18. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased, following consultations with the witnesses, even though we had to work quite hastily, we had consultation, and what I am tabling here is an amendment suggested by the Commissioner of Official Languages. As I said earlier, the bilingual institutional culture is important. Bilingualism must be visible and present, and therefore I am pleased to introduce the following motion that Bill C-13 in Clause 16 be amended, A, by replacing in the English version line 15 on page 9 with the following. 3. Paragraph 36(1)(c) of the Act is replaced. B, by replacing lines 17 to 23 on page 9 with the following. C, ensure that, 1, every employee is supervised by their managers and supervisors in the official language of their choice, regardless of the linguistic identification of their position, and 2, any management group that is responsible for the general direction of the institution as a whole has the capacity to function in both official languages. As legislators, we need to ensure that we are encouraging the development of bilingualism in our institutions without being coercive, and I think that this would help achieve that objective. Mr. Drouin, I want to thank my colleague for introducing this amendment. I want to suggest a sub-amendment. I have copies as well, but just before reading this, I want to distribute the sub-amendment. Thank you. We'll just suspend for a moment while this is being distributed.
Après ça, on peut suspendre peut-être, Monsieur le Président? Je vais le lire dans le
OK,
rapport.
nous reprenons.
puis-
Faisez-en la lecture, puis après
OK.
ça, on suspendra.
Faisez-en, c'est ça. Je fais, tu fais, il, elle fait.
So that CPC 18 modifying clause 16 be amended by replacing in the English version line 15 on page 9 with, to be modified as following. If under B, where the workplace environment inaudible. Where they carry out their supervisory duties. C, replacing the text proposed in subclause 2 of paragraph B with the following. Every employee is supervised by their managers and supervisors in the official language of their choice, regardless of the linguistic identification of their position. And D, adding after the text proposed in number 2 of paragraph B of that motion, a new paragraph D with the following text. D, ensure that any management group that is responsible for the general direction of the institution as a whole has the capacity to function in both official languages. So the text reads C, ensure that if it is appropriate in order to create a work environment that is conducive to the effective use of both official languages, 1, managers and supervisors are able to communicate in both official languages with employees of the institution in carrying out their managerial or supervisory responsibilities. And 2, every employee is supervised by their managers and supervisors in the official language of their choice, regardless of the linguistic identification of their position. And D, ensure that any management group that is responsible for the general direction of the institution as a whole has the capacity to function in both official languages. This would support the principles that, yes, I should be able to speak in French or English with my employees, but at the same time, I should be able to communicate with my supervisor in French or English, and they should be able to communicate with me in French or English. Thank you, Mr. Juen. I see that the French and English versions arrived at the same time. We'll suspend briefly. We shall resume. Colleagues, we will pick up where we left off. A sub-amendment proposed by Mr. Jouen. For amendment CPC 18, Mr. Jouen has read and explained his sub-amendment. Would you like to add anything? Nothing to add, but I would ask the officials before the committee to weigh in on what this amendment would do.
Le problème, c'est que quelqu'un du côté...
That's fine. Does any department want to weigh in? Just very simply, the amendment proposed. Does anyone want to know? Anyone want to comment on what this sub-amendment specifically would do?
Oui, merci pour la question. Donc,
Thank you for the question. Currently, we are only talking about designated bilingual regions, where there is a right to work in the official language of your choice. In these regions, there are bilingual teams and unilingual teams. A unilingual team is one that, let's say in Quebec, let's say there's a team in Quebec City made up entirely of Francophones with a supervisor. Currently, that supervisor does not need to be bilingual because they are supervising a team of Francophones. Why would the supervisor then have to be bilingual? With this amendment, employees, even if they have a unilingual Francophone position, would have the right to wake up one day and say, I want to be supervised in English. To get ahead of that possibility, the supervisor would therefore have to be bilingual. Sorry, I shouldn't have been talking about Quebec City. I should have been talking about Montreal, which is a bilingual region. In Montreal, if there's a team of Francophones supervised by a manager, currently the manager would have to be bilingual under this amendment. That good, Mr. Godin? Well, actually, Mr. Quell, and sorry, Mr. Chair, I would like to speak with Mr. Quell. What I would like to know is, right now you're saying the supervisor does not have to be bilingual. Now, let's say an employee wants to speak with their supervisor in French. The supervisor would not have to be bilingual. But it must be understood that if you look at the chain of command, you know, we all know there's a hierarchy within the federal public service. If this supervisor then wants to communicate with the rung above him or her, and that person's unilingual Anglophone, then there's a communication breakdown. So how would that work? The higher up you go, the more positions are designated bilingual because you're supervising greater numbers of people. And you're speaking to a broader team. But when there are smaller teams, lower down on the hierarchy, this would apply. It can occur that all the people have their positions designated the same way. So let's say they're unilingual French positions. Right now, what we're discussing is, for those people in a unilingual team, should the supervisor be bilingual? Up till this point, the answer to that question has been no, because the supervisor is only supervising people with, say, unilingual Francophone positions. But if this amendment carries, the supervisor would be required to be bilingual, just in case one day, and here we'll get technical, a person with a unilingual Francophone position decides to be supervised in English. We're talking about a very rare circumstance, but it could happen in a bilingual region. I could wake up one day and say, my position is Francophone, but I want to be supervised in English. Those are the cases we are currently discussing. And in those cases, the supervisor would have to attend language training. The government would have to spend money on training them. However, for all intents and purposes, this is not something that happens very often, that a supervisor would need to supervise their team in the other official language. I'm going to just comment on the wording you used. This is Canada. We are a bilingual country. I would not say that I wouldn't call it spending money. I would call it investing in official languages, but that's beside the point. Can you please, I know you don't have the numbers, but just as a proportion, within the current public service, how many people are bilingual, how many people are unilingual Anglophone, and how many people are unilingual Francophone? Thank you. Now, of course, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now. What I can say is 42% of positions within the federal public service are designated bilingual. Within the National Capital Region and other bilingual regions, that percentage is even higher. The reason most positions are unilingual is because these are positions located in the Canadian West or in the North or in unilingual Francophone regions in Quebec or in Eastern Canada. Most positions within the federal public service are unilingual. I have another question, Chair. Yes, this is a question for my colleague, Mr. Drouin, the esteemed president of the OPF. Under I, in his sub-amendment, are we on the same page here? C1. Oh, sorry. So, in D, my apologies. And, Chair, I don't understand why there's two Cs. But that's not what my question is about. I'm not questioning the formatting. What do you mean by carry out their managerial or supervisory responsibilities? If you look at it in both official languages, it basically means carry out their duties. Chair, shouldn't we have clearer wording? Looks like something's missing. You're asking me the question, but I'm the chair. Takes 2 seconds to ask you a question. Why not? Well, I appreciate that reflex, but I'm not the one who can answer that question. That's not my role as chair. Mr. Drouin, over to you. I'll ask the question to the officials because they are the ones who will need to deal with the law. How do you interpret this wording? Thank you for your question. A manager is a manager until they become an employee working with their superior. So here we want to ensure that we're talking about, when I manage a team, if I'm a manager, I need to supervise my team in the official language of their choice. But then when I turn towards my superior, I'm a manager, but I become an employee with the right to choose the official language I communicate in.
C'est correct, Monsieur le Président. Donc, si...
So, Mr. Chairman, so the manager is the employee of the director, who's the employee of the director general, and on up to the minister, right? In principle? Is that how it works? Yes. Mr. Beaulieu. So I just want to be clear. What you are saying is that this sub-amendment would mean that in Quebec, that every supervisor would have to know English if they already know French. Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. In bilingual regions, and I mentioned Montreal and Sherbrooke, all supervisors in those regions must be bilingual, even if their employees hold unilingual French positions. So in bilingual regions of Quebec, so we're talking here about the Eastern Townships and Montreal, essentially. So even if the employees are unilingual French, a bilingual region doesn't mean that all the employees are bilingual. It means that they have the right to choose the language in which they would like to be supervisors. So you can have bilingual supervisors or unilingual supervisors that supervise unilingual employees, but here you would be requiring the supervisors to be bilingual. Thank you. Mr. Godin? Mr. Chairman, once again, it bothers me when Mr. Quayle says that certain regions of Quebec are bilingual, even though Quebec is a French-speaking province, but that depends on your definition. So how do you define these regions? Well, bilingual regions are defined by the Treasury Board going back to a policy in 1967, and bilingual region might be a surprising term, but it really means bilingual in terms of language of work. This is an internal term. We're not talking about anything but the right of employees to choose the language in which they will be supervised. So this applies to certain areas, certain regions of Quebec, all of New Brunswick, parts of Northern Ontario, the National Capital Region, for the language of work. So what I understand from that is that there are no bilingual regions outside Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. That's my first question. And my second question is as follows. You said that this term has been used going back to 1977. So what work has been done to update the status of that, and what are the criteria for determining that bilingual region status? The regions are in part of the Act, and that goes back to 1977. And how they can be updated is only through changing the legislation. So you're saying that right now there is no mechanism for updating those regions? No, there has been no change since the Act was updated in 1992. I'm sorry. I just want to say that the first question he asked, did you answer that? I just want to make sure. He wanted to know whether bilingual regions existed outside Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. I'm sorry. That is the case, only in those three provinces. The entire province of New Brunswick and certain parts of Quebec and Ontario. So what you have just said is that New Brunswick as a whole is bilingual, parts of Quebec, but in fact, I think that Quebec is a unilingual French province. You have bilingual regions in Quebec, but in New Brunswick, you're saying that the entire province is officially bilingual. We're talking about the internal workings of the public service. These bilingual regions were developed to identify areas where there was a need for bilingual language of work, for example, the National Capital Region. So these regions are where employees can choose the language in which they will be supervised. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, perhaps this is something we could study here in the committee. I would like to ask another question of Mr. Quell. Well, in fact, there are other people that would like to speak. So, Mr. Beaulieu, we'll go to you. I'm going to have to vote against this because I don't think that this should apply to Quebec because it forces people to have to work in English. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. I didn't understand what Mr. Beaulieu said. I didn't. Well, it means that, for example, some people who work with unilingual Francophone employees have to learn English. And I feel that this is a perverse effect on Quebec. Mr. Gaudin. Well, that wasn't long before you came back to me. I would like Mr. Quell or Ms. Boyer or Ms. Terrien or Mr. Fallu and Mr. Newman. I want to come back to this wording, carrying out their managerial or supervisory responsibilities. I want something to be as clear as possible. We can't suggest changing the wording without proposing a sub-amendment. I understand what you want to do, but it would have to be a sub-amendment to Mr. Drouin's sub-amendment. Okay. I do understand what you're talking about, but we are dealing with Mr. Drouin's sub-amendment. So this is a question of procedure that I have. Could Mr. Drouin change his sub-amendment? How can we do that? Well, with unanimous consent. To answer your question, it would take the unanimous consent of the committee. What does he mean? Why does he have trouble with the wording of the amendment? Because we've asked what it means. If he has trouble with a particular word that is used in French, attribution, then perhaps we can find something. Perhaps we can ask the officials to provide us with their definition just so that we can be clear. Mr. Gaudin, please go ahead. Well, my colleague asked me a question. I think that it limits the scope. It doesn't mean the overall governance and the day-to-day operations. So when you in French, it sounds limiting. It sounds like just when you delegate the work. I am just going to find a definition. Mr. Gaudin, if I may, these were legal drafters that provided the wording here, and I don't use that wording particularly myself, but I don't want to impose anything on you, but I have to say that we have legal drafters that have come up with the wording. It was even voted on. So you wanted to look for a synonym or, well, with all due respect for the drafters, it doesn't mean that it's perfect just because they propose the wording. But And the objective certainly isn't to criticize anybody, but we want to strengthen the wording to make it as tight as possible. If we can't get a change and we can't ask our colleague to correct it, we'll have to just vote and go on. Any other comments? Nobody around the table. So on Mr. Drouin's sub-amendment to the CPC amendment.
Monsieur Drouin.
Pour.
Monsieur Iacono.
Pour.
Madame Kayabaga.
Pour.
Madame Latanzio. Monsieur Godin.
À la grande surprise de bien du monde, je vais voter pour.
Monsieur Gourde.
Pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu. Madame Ashton.
Pour.
Donc 10.
So we have 10 in favor, 1 against. The sub-amendment is adopted. Now, on the main clause, we have CPC 18, CPC 14. The vote.
Kayabaga est pour.
Non, c'est parce qu'il
Il est gelé.
Pour, ouais.
Monsieur Iacono, peut-être le signe du pouce.
Mr. Iacono, if you could just put your thumb up or down. 4.
Pour.
Madame Latanzio.
Pour.
Monsieur Godin.
Pour.
Monsieur Gourde.
Pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Contre.
Madame Ashton.
Pour.
Donc 10 pour, 1 contre.
10 for, 1 against. CPC 18, as amended, carries. We now move to BQ 21. So it's a question of the lines here. In fact, this is not admissible. Please go ahead, Mr. Beaulieu. What I didn't understand was this was an addition, and it only applies to the English version. So there's a replacement in the English. There's no effect on the French. I just wanted to add this. So Mr. Beaulieu is saying that there are differences in the wording in English and French in BQ 19, and the legislative clerk has already indicated that the two versions are equivalent, and if this is adopted, then we will have the same. Rather, BQ 21, not BQ 19. There's an error there. So what I can say, Mr. Beaulieu, is that in the English version, there is no talk of an addition. There's a replacement of lines 15 to 23, and the legal drafters have said this is exactly what would have to happen. So that's why there was a problem with the lines.
Remplacé par adjoint. En tout cas, on le reverra éventuellement. Là.
Well, we may have to come back to this. It's kind of gone over my head what exactly the problem is. Mr. Chairman? Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Godin. So my colleague has said that we would come back to it, but in fact we can't do that. We have to debate it now, don't we? We can ask questions about the process. If there is unanimous consent around the table, then no. The lines in CPC 18 has already dealt with the part that would be subject to BQ 21, so it's impossible to consider it because CPC 18 has already dealt with that. I'm not even sure what I voted on now. But I'm looking at the French version. There is an addition after line 19 in French. I'm sorry. No, if you look at the French version and you compare it with the English, you should look at the English because it says replacing lines 15 to 23. So we checked with the legal drafter. So there would be a replacement of lines that have already been affected by the previous amendment. CPC 18. Perhaps I could ask our legislative staff to speak to this. Well, we are not legal drafters, but when it was drafted, I can't tell you if it could have been done another way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that information. I'm working in French, not in English. We're all learning something today. My colleague.
Deux collègues, là. Oui, mais en français, ça se faisait parce qu'on ne l'avait pas coupé. Regarde dans ta liasse, ça se terminait à la ligne. Je viens de reprocher, je ne te répondrai pas.
Monsieur, parfait. Merci.
Thank you. Well, I haven't ruled on the admissibility or not of the amendment here. When CPC 18 passed, then that makes this one inadmissible. And if hypothetically it was admissible, when we got to these lines, then the line numbers would no longer make sense. So it's not a decision that I'm making. It's just that once we adopted CPC 18, then we can't make these changes that are proposed here. Maybe it's a question of translation. I understand, Mr. Beaulieu, it's not that there's a problem with the translation. This is a procedural issue. That's all I can tell you. And so that said, I'm not saying that you will be happy with the answer, but is Clause 16 adopted as amended? Adopted. Carried. Clause 17 carried? Carried. And that brings us to Clause 18 and Amendment BQ 22. Mr. Beaulieu, page 57. That Clause 18 be amended by replacing line 19 on page 10 with the following: use of either official language by their employees, taking into account the minority status of the French language in Canada due to the predominant use of English and the English specificity of Quebec. So we have this amendment that follows what was already in the Act. So this has been asked for by the government of Quebec.
It would add a further criterion that needs to be taken into account by the Governor and Council when they change regulations surrounding the language of work in the federal government. They would need to take into account the linguistic specificity of Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Your questions around the table or on the screen. Over to you. Thank you, Chair. Obviously, I appreciate the intention of this amendment, but I would like to ask Ms. Boyer and her team what the impact of this amendment would be on language of work within the federal public service. We know it would have an effect in Quebec, but what about other federal offices? Could you weigh in, please? Thank you. Just to talk about the context, we are talking about federal institutions and bilingual regions. We are also talking about workplaces conducive to the use of both official languages. What does this mean in reality? This means that a manager must allow his or her employees to speak both official languages in meetings, for instance. They must encourage their employees to choose the language that they wish to work in. They must create a workplace where people are equally comfortable speaking to supervisors in either official language. Up till now, we, the Treasury Board Secretariat, have encouraged managers in the same way, including bilingual managers outside Quebec in bilingual regions or inside Quebec. Under this amendment, we would need to ask the question of what should managers do differently in designated bilingual regions in Quebec? Would they be required to encourage the use of one language less than another? That would be the question we would have to ask ourselves. Anyone else? No one on the screen, no one around the table. I say we move to a vote.
Contre.
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono? Monsieur Iacono?
Contre.
Madame Kayabaga?
Contre.
Madame Latanzio?
Contre.
Monsieur Godin?
Excusez-moi, c'est bien.
Sorry, this is BQ 22?
Monsieur Gourde? Monsieur Généreux?
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux?
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu?
Pour.
Madame Ashton?
Contre.
Donc 6 contre.
6 nays, 5 yeas. BQ 22 is defeated. Does Clause 18 carry? Yes? Clause 19. Does Clause 19 carry? No one is against. No abstentions. Okay, carried. Does Clause 20 carry? Yes? This brings us to Clause 21, and with it, LIB 12. Mr. Juan? Oh, sorry, Mr. Juan. If Lib 12 carries, Lib 13 is precluded because they are largely identical. Point of order. Could you please explain how the same party can table 2 identical amendments? Sometimes it can happen. Everyone is working independently. I've seen it happen in the Bloc. I've seen it happen with the Conservatives. It can happen. People come up with the same idea. And when it all goes through the workings of legislative drafting, the same thing happens twice. Well, with the Bloc and the Conservatives, it's because we both listen to the same witnesses. I'll start again. Lib 12, page 59 of the bundle. If Lib 12 carries, Lib 13 cannot be moved because it is identical. BQ 23 cannot be moved due to a line conflict. Mr. Beaulieu? BQ 23. It would not be unmovable due to a line conflict. Inaudible. All right, that's fine. Mr. Juan, the floor is yours. You may weigh in on Amendment Lib 12. Yes, so it would say that Bill C-13 and Clause 21 be amended by replacing lines 1 and 2 on page 11 with the following. Number 21. The heading of Part 7 and Sections 41 and 42 of the Act are replaced by the following. advancement of equality of status and use of English and French.
Question autour de la table.
Any questions around the table? Anyone on the screen? Mr. Beaulieu, over to you. Well, I'm going to vote against. Because we do not believe that Anglophones constitute a minority. There is only one minority language, one minority official language, and that is French. And there's only one official language that is threatened, and that is French. Mr. Godin, over to you. Well, very quickly, I just want to outline that my colleague's amendment, really, I think we're all in favor of equality of status for both official languages. So I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. Jouen, for his work. Thank you. Any other questions? Madam Clerk, shall we proceed to a vote? Let's proceed to a vote.
Lib 12. Monsieur Serré.
Pour.
Monsieur Drouin.
Pour.
Monsieur Iacono.
Pour.
Madame Kayabaga. Pour. Madame Latanzio. Pour. Monsieur Godin.
Pour.
Monsieur Gourde.
Pour.
Monsieur Généreux.
Pour.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Pour.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Ça, c'est laquelle? Excuse-moi. Pour. Non, contre. Excusez. Contre.
Madame Ashton.
Pour.
C'est bon. Donc 10 pour.
10 pour, 1 contre.
10 yeas, 1 nay. Lib 12 carries. We skip Lib 13. BQ 23. What did you want, Mr. Beaulieu? Inaudible. And you distributed this. We're going to suspend briefly so that everyone can read up on the new version of BQ 23.
It took some time because the impact in changing the lines has an impact on a whole series of other amendments. So before speaking to BQ23, I have to say that if this is adopted, BQ21, BQ27, BQ31, CPC 26, Liberal 14, Lib 15, BQ 32, CPC 28, and CPC 31 cannot be moved because there will be a line conflict here. So we have the best possible advice, and that's the decision. So just before going any further, there are a lot of amendments that will be affected. So just take note. I'll go over them again. If BQ 23 is adopted, CPC 21, BQ 27, BQ 31, CPC 26, Lib 14, Lib 15, BQ 32, CPC 28, and CPC 31 cannot be moved because there will be a conflict of lines. Has everyone understood? I'm not going to repeat it again. I see that it is 1731. Do we have unanimous consent to go for 5 minutes to finish with this amendment? So please go ahead, Mr. Beaulieu. This is very important because the positive measures over the last 52 years have done nothing but reinforce English and go against French and the vitality of French. So we need to make this change so that the Official Languages Act and its positive measures promote vitality, and this will, right now, the message to newcomers is you don't have to learn French, you can pick whichever language you want, and that just underlines and promotes English as a predominant language. I think that this is even vital to self-determination by Quebecers. If our language development and measures that come under the Act go in this direction, then this is problematic. We need to be a country where we really have two official languages. In Belgium, for example, there isn't one that predominates over the other, and that ensures the future of French in the Wallon region and Dutch in the northern region. So what we're suggesting here is to, in clause 21, replacing lines 1 and 2 on page 11 with the replacing lines 13 and 14 on page 11 with the following: due to the predominant use of English and that it is the official and common language in Quebec, then we make sure that we respect the Charter of the French language. And without that, we won't be able to protect French. We have an admission that French has declined, and we need to recognize that French is the minority language in Canada, that Quebecers have French as their common language. And we know that the English in Quebec are part of the language majority. They have well-funded, in fact, overly funded institutions in Quebec, much more so than Francophones have in similar contexts. So we mention here as well that we do have some measures in this overall clause that promote French, but we want to replace line 32 on page 11 to include respect for the linguistic development of Quebec provided for in the Charter of the French language, and call here for the necessity of considering the specific and different needs of each of the two official language communities in Canada, and the need to protect and promote French in Quebec, taking into account that French is the common and official language of Quebec. And finally, that we have the Minister of Canadian Heritage and the provincial and territorial governments making regulations to support this. So this is the basic explanation. If there is a true will to protect French in Quebec, then we need the flexibility to ensure respect for French as the minority language in Quebec overall. Mr. Godin, I just have a little comment. I think that what my colleague has just said, I certainly am receptive to it, but we have the Charter of the French language mentioned already, and therefore this is not necessary. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Are there any other comments either here in the room or on the screen? If not, the clerk will proceed to the vote.
Ouais. Monsieur Seri.
Contre.
Monsieur Drouin.
Contre.
Monsieur Iacono.
Contre.
Madame Kayabaga.
Contre.
Madame Latanzio.
Contre.
Monsieur Godin.
Contre.
Monsieur Gourde.
Contre.
Monsieur Généreux.
Contre.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Contre.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Pour.
Madame Ashton.
Contre.
Donc, 10.
So we have 10 against, 1 for. BQ 23 is defeated. I want to, before we conclude, thank our experts who are here from the departments, our clerks, our legislative advisors, and others. That's it. Mr. Beaulieu, did you want to raise something? I just have a quick comment. Just to say that we've done 21 clauses, and we are only on page 57 out of 229. We only have a few meetings left. We're going to have to make a decision on how we go forward to protect French. Thank you, and thank you to all members. The meeting is adjourned.